Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the latest in Afghanistan. The Taliban have offered amnesty for former Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani and other senior officials, saying they can return to the country if they want. And the group said it could announce a framework for a new government in a few weeks. The Taliban has control over most of Afghanistan now, though there are still pockets of resistance in the country's north. The Taliban said it is trying to hold talks with the resistance. A Taliban spokesperson did rule out an extension of the August 31st deadline for the withdrawal of international troops from Afghanistan, mainly the U.S. troops, calling it a red line. Evacuations pick up steam in Kabul, with many desperate to flee the country. One was killed at Kabul airport on Monday when German and U.S. forces took part in a gun battle after Afghan guards and unknown assailants exchanged fire. Meanwhile, Kabul's main commercial street held a bazaar on Sunday. Many people came out of their homes, but some businesses are worried over the rising prices of basic goods and fewer customers.
The items we buy, such as flour and gas, are very expensive because the Afghan currency is losing its value against the US dollar. Everything is getting more expensive.
The business is down. It is not good. But security is better than before. We are trying to survive. Food items are very expensive. There is no one to ask and control the prices.
There are fewer people in the city now, but it might be people who are afraid or don't want to come to the bazaar. Patients' numbers have declined, but our shop has opened since last week, and we are happy about the current security and peace in the city.
A lot of things are going on all at the same time in Afghanistan. For the latest there, we are joined in Kabul via Skype. Fahim Sadat, head of the International Relations Department of Kardan University. Mr. Sadat, thank you for joining us. My latest information is about the Kabul International Airport. What do we know now about the reason and the so-called unknown assailants? Who are they that were firing at the airport?
Well, the Kabul airport had been missed for a long time.
We are probably
there are a lot of people to cross into the airport so that they have the opportunity of fleeing the country. We have people there now who are government officials. We have people who are collaborators with the coalition forces and U.S. forces, and we have people there who are just ordinary people and who just want to flee the country. And this has brought up a miss, and the evacuation capacity seems to be smaller than the surge of the people that is around the airport. And that has created a bizarre situation. There are firing at times because different group of people, such as the 01 Corps of the previous government, the coalition forces, and also the Taliban, trying to control the situation and trying to disperse the population that has accumulated there. But still, we see that people are surging every day, and they are yet to leave the area back to their homes.
The unraveling situation in Afghanistan has drawn global concerns, especially from neighboring countries such as Pakistan. Scores of Afghan nationals have arrived in Pakistan since Taliban entered Kabul. And in the past years, many Afghans have fled to Pakistan due to turmoil in their hometowns. Pakistan did stress the need to stick to the principle of non-interference in Afghanistan. Pakistan has long been seen as holding some considerable sway over the Taliban. Earlier, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Pakistani Foreign Minister had a phone conversation. Wang from China said China and Pakistan need to strengthen communication and coordination to support a stable transition in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Pakistani counterpart said Afghanistan needs a political settlement through future negotiations. More on the latest in Afghanistan and the role of Pakistan on the Afghan situation, we are joined in Lahore, Musharraf Zaidi, Senior Fellow of Tabadab, is an Islamabad-based think tank, and in Kabul, Fahim Sadat once again from the University of Khadan, and in Beijing, last but not least, Li Guofu, Director from the Center of Middle East Studies with China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I know our link to Afghanistan might be a little bit tricky right now, technically speaking, but we hope we would have you throughout the conversation, Mr. Sadat. But let me begin by asking you, Mr. Zaidi, what do you make of the turmoil that is going on in Kabul airport and the firing and the killing of one person at least?
It's terrible. We've all been watching the situation at the Hamid Karzai International Airport now for the better part of a week. And I think it speaks to the utter failure of the imagination and preparation that went into this withdrawal. But it also speaks, I think, more importantly, to the utter failure of the leadership of Afghanistan prior to the fall of Kabul to the Taliban. I think that President Ashraf Ghani had a good two and a half years to prepare for a transition, knowing full well that the Taliban would never accept a situation in which any kind of transition is led by President Ghani. And despite knowing this, he chose to cling to power for as long as he could. And when he did exit, he exited in a way that ensured the maximum instability and confusion.
There are different voices that we are hearing, both from the media reports and also from different factions in Afghanistan. Mr. Zaidi, now many believe Pakistan is having a relatively close relationship and good impact, big impact, shall we say, on the Taliban in Afghanistan. So I want to get your opinion about the Taliban giving amnesty to the President Ghani. Do you think it is sincere? Because many are worried whether those messages are really sincere, particularly regarding the former government officials who the Taliban now want to call back to the country and let them go back to work.
I think that, I would not judge the Taliban's promises purely on face value. We have to assess both on the basis of evidence, which is very little because they've only been in charge for so many days, but also on the basis of what we understand about the Taliban. The Quetta, or rather the Doha Shura, which is the group of the Taliban leadership that are taking charge in Kabul, are very sophisticated and clearly understand the importance of abiding by certain principles, both in terms of human rights and in terms of diplomacy with countries like China, even with countries like the United States. But the Taliban, of course, is a much larger force than just the people that are flying in from Doha. And I think that the differences between the ground troops and the commanders, who are much more hardcore and who've done all of the fighting for the last so many years, versus the sophistication of the Doha Shura, which is the Taliban leadership, I think those differences will inform the degree to which the Taliban are able to keep some of these promises of amnesty. Ultimately, the Taliban is an ideological movement, so I would not expect the Taliban to give up some of their ideological rigidity and harshness.
Mr. Zaidi, I want to follow up also about the question regarding the U.S. Possibility to postpone the deadline of withdrawal. Now, there's a big dispute between the United States and the Taliban now about that deadline. Taliban call it the red line. U.S. suggests, well, the things are not finished yet. We still need to have some more time. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the Taliban have to act very wisely and carefully here. I think their negotiating tactics and habits that they've developed in Doha will not translate so nicely now that they're in charge of Kabul. Whether that red line means anything remains to be seen, but frankly, the Taliban cannot afford to engage in any kind of sort of firefights or military action if the U.S. presence does extend beyond that deadline, principally not so much because the U.S. and the Taliban government are going to be very friendly, because I don't think they will be, but because the Taliban, in order to run their country, require the financial access that the U.S. will be a very important decider on. Without the IMF, without the Treasury financing of the Afghan central bank, without the Afghan government bonds or other kinds of securities that they own, without having access to that, the Taliban will not be able to run Afghanistan. So I think the Taliban have to act in a measured and calm way and not be too strident about the red lines that they're defining.
Mr. Lee, your point.
I think, the Taliban will be very careful because and sometimes, they give the warning already that, not allowed the U.S. Troops stay beyond the deadline. But we also see that, the U.S. president has already made some promise to the U.S. or to its airlines that, when necessarily, the U.S. evacuation process would be stay beyond the deadline they have reached with the Taliban. I believe if the necessity or the requirements will be needed and on the ground, and the U.S. would maybe to negotiate some of the arrangements, maybe the U.S. would stay in the international airport in Kabul beyond the deadline. We know that the U.S. military has on the daily basis very close kind of communicate with Taliban forces. So that's, if needed, that would be possible. And I personally believe Taliban would also consider the consequences if they would not allow the U.S. stay beyond the deadline if the U.S. would need it, really need it.
Mr. Zaidi, well, at the same time, there are pockets of fighting that's going on in Afghanistan. We know the Northern Alliance and some of the other forces are fighting very hard in the Panjshir Valley. And the Taliban have been suggesting troops are being organized to fight against those resistance. And now we've been hearing different voices from Afghanistan. What are some of the latest that you have from your sources, and how are things going on there?
Well, I think the first thing to say about this is that it's remarkable that the resistance is as limited as it has been. And the fact that fighting is restricted, A, that it took this long for fighting to break out, and B, that it's constrained or restricted to the Panjshir Valley, I think those are very positive signs, because it means that the leadership, other than Ashraf Ghani, leaders like Hamid Karzai, Abdullah, and Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, the three-member commission that is engaged in trying to ensure that there's an inclusive, participatory government, those folks, as you would have seen over the last few days, they've been involved in talking to the Panjshiri resistance as well. Hopefully that process yields some results, but the fact that it's restricted there, I think, is the good news. The bad news is,
Mr. Zaidi, if I could just follow up about that, what you just said, whether it's a good sign or a bad sign, quote unquote, there are media reports coming out that's suggesting whether President Karzai, together with Dr. Abdullah, are really having personal freedom in about the things that they want to do, the people they want to talk to, and the places they want to stay. Now, we know that President Karzai, the former president, was being assigned with a group of guards to guard against any danger for him and his family. Now, those guards are being taken away by the Taliban, according to some media reports. In other words, Taliban is in control of the compound in which former President Karzai was in. And now Mr. Karzai, according to media reports, have been moving in with Dr. Abdullah. So there seems to be a lot of things going on besides just the nuances according to the Taliban's voice. So tell me more. Of course, I understand different people have different opinions and perspectives. Mr. Zaidi, things are not as rosy as we earlier, quote unquote, learned from the Taliban.
No, and I think that reasonable commentators and observers have been warning that the very effective public diplomacy that has been launched by the Taliban and that the Taliban has perfected whilst learning how to negotiate with the U.S. government through Zalmay Khalilzad and with many other governments through special envoys, including the special envoy from Russia, the special envoy from China, the special envoy from Pakistan and from the European Union. I think that experience has enabled the Taliban to package and deliver messages very effectively. But the dynamic of how things will proceed from here will depend much more on the reality of the appetite for forgiveness and reconciliation amongst the ground troops, the ground commanders that have helped win this war for the Taliban, more and more and less on the Doha Shura. So I think how that dynamic plays out and how effectively the Doha Shura can convince their colleagues from Kandahar, from Helmand, that actually playing along with the international system and keeping the promises made by the Doha Shura is vital for the economic vitality of Afghanistan. I think that'll really be one of the key elements that will determine the future of Afghanistan in the near term.
Now let me go to Mr. Sadat. I hope you can hear my voice and I can hear you clearly. Mr. Sadat, can you? On the phone.
Yes, I can hear you. I'm
Wonderful,
sorry
sir.
for the
Wonderful. Let me ask you another question, which is also crucial. Probably you have a better judgment inside Afghanistan than most of us. Right now, we know, according to the brother of Mr. Massoud, who passed away, of course, earlier as a result of the killing of him and some of the others from his faction in Afghanistan, we learned from his brother that the kinds of settlement that we're talking about is not, according to his brother, quote, not a peace settlement, but rather a political settlement. Now, what Mr. Zaidi said earlier become very crucial. That is how political it could be and how much voices can be heard and balance can be learned. So, Mr. Sadat, what's your gut feeling given the sources that you have inside Afghanistan and the latest information?
Actually, the point is that the Taliban are not rushing to announce a government to avoid isolation if there is not a government that is all-inclusive and wide-ranging and that includes different people and different political parties and different politicians for that matter, and particularly those who hold an opposite opinion about from the Taliban. Because if something like that happens, that will make it complicated for the Taliban to convince the international community and as well as the population or the people of Afghanistan that they are being inclusive now. So there are also challenges.
I think I have a big difficulty listening to you clearly. I'm really sorry, and it's such a pity, but I hope to be able to contact you in the future for our discussion. Mr. Lee is sitting here in the Beijing studio with us. Mr. Lee, different factions in Afghanistan have very different opinions. So tell me more about your thoughts at this critical juncture. How much voices we need to hear from different sides, and how much sound judgment the international community should have at this point?
I think, because Taliban's the future rule, so generally speaking, the average, the Afghanistans are right to maybe to have some worrisome about what they may be, live under the Taliban government. But still, and many people have said, from last week's Taliban's rule in Kabul, for example, the people live quite, free, and the city is quite, some people even find, the more secure. And so people are gradually, or little by little, get used to live under the Taliban rule. But it is too early at this moment to judge, what kind of Taliban will have at this time. So, we have got, the confused or mixed information from all, the groups of society. But still, we may give the hope and to the Taliban this time, because we judging from what, they have said, that what they have promised to the international community as well as the Afghan people. So they may need the opportunity and let the time to prove whether Taliban would implement their promise or not.
Mr. Lee wants to give them the benefit of doubt. What about you, Mr. Zaidi? Do you think they need more time to prove themselves whether they are following the Doha agreement or not? Briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of evidence that the statements that they've been making are very positive, but that the lives of ordinary Afghans are not yet reflecting that positivity. So how they will succeed in doing that, given that there's already a freeze on Afghan money in terms of the likely IMF payment and some of the holdings of the Afghan government. We're already, as you mentioned in your report, there's escalation in inflation in day-to-day consumer goods in Kabul and invariably in the rest of the country. So any kind of economic crisis, which I think is already beginning, is going to create even more pressure on the Taliban to demonstrate that their promises and their public diplomacy is actually rooted in some ground truth.
All right.
And the first thing that ideological movements do when they're faced with pressure is they bank on ideology, not on human rights or other ideas.
And that's the danger of it, isn't it? Mr. Zaidi, we earlier touched on the impact the Pakistani side could have and should have on the Taliban. How much room do you see with the vacuum by the so-called U.S. chaotic exit in Afghanistan does it mean for Pakistan?
Look, I think that the role of Pakistan throughout the last 40 years in Afghanistan has been overstated by people both inside Pakistan. So too many Pakistanis have tried to show that they have a lot of influence in Afghanistan, and too many foreigners, especially from the West, including the U.S. government and other Western governments and NATO countries, have insisted that Pakistan has great power and control over Afghan territory and the Taliban, whereas in fact the Taliban pride themselves first and foremost as Afghans. And the number one quality of the Afghan people is their autonomy, their sovereignty, and their independence.
I see.
Now that the Taliban is in power in Afghanistan, they're going to be even less receptive to Pakistan than they have been in the recent past. So I think Pakistani influence, already overstated, is going to actually decrease rather than increase.
Interesting. I also want to get view from you, Mr. Lee. There are two things. The Pakistani government, their impact on the Taliban and Afghanistan, and the Taliban in Pakistan, which is at this moment very different from Afghan Taliban. One is a terrorist organization in Pakistan, the other is not in Afghanistan. So how do you see this mixture of texture in terms of how much Pakistan could have an impact on Afghanistan? Mr. Lee, I know it's a complicated question, but I hope you will be able to explain to us in some brief words. Mr. Lee.
Though we have two Talibans, and one in Afghanistan and the other in Pakistan, but these two organizations may have the same in name, but they have different of their goals and also the ideologies. And for Afghanistan and the Taliban, the final goal or what they aim is to rule the country. And for the Pakistan Taliban, and they have two. One is against the government, and the other is maybe to attacking those foreigners in order to weaken its government. So you can see that it's totally different. They have already break up. There have been a lot of fightings between these two Talibans. And I think, Taliban rule of Afghanistan may provide Pakistan with another new opportunities. Because if you look around, Taliban's, its neighboring countries, and Pakistan is the right country for those, especially I think the Western countries, to influence or to strengthen their presence in Afghanistan in order to communicate or to influence the Taliban government in Kabul. So I believe this is maybe a historical opportunity for Pakistan government to prove that what kind of importance role it can play in order maybe to act as a bridge between Taliban, the Afghanistan, as well as the West world.
Interesting. Things are evolving as we speak. Of course, we're going to follow up in every day of our discussion. For now, I want to thank both of you, Ashraf in Lahore, Pakistan, Li Guofu in Beijing with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen.